Hello and welcome to the latest episode of IMTV. I'm your host for tonight, Adam Booth. I'm the editor of Socialist.net. That's the website of Socialist Appeal, which is the British section of the IMT. And for those who are watching for the first time and don't know, the IMT is the International Marxist Tendency, which brings you IMTV, our YouTube channel. And the International Marxist Tendency is a revolutionary organisation with sections in over 40 countries, running the website Marxist.com. So head there if you're interested in getting involved and finding out more. And tonight we're going to be discussing the situation in Europe, where obviously there's been a lot of chaos over the last couple of months, and in fact over the last decade in terms of the Euro crisis. And I'm going to be joined in a minute by Josh Holroyd, who's a fellow writer, comrade at Socialist Appeal. And he's going to be discussing with us some of the contradictions and some of the perspectives for the European project. Just a reminder, obviously this is a live broadcast and you can send in your questions for Josh, and hopefully we'll have some time for those at the end of the show. So without further ado, let me bring in Josh. Hello there, Josh. Can you hear us
Hi,
okay?
Adam.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
keeping
yeah, I
well?
can hear you fine. Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you again. Now, some of our viewers might not realise that you and I actually discussed just a few weeks ago on this question of the Euro crisis
That's right.
for the sister podcast, Marxist Voice, run by Socialist Appeal. And from what I remember back then, just a few weeks ago, you were describing, as I said, this chaos in the European Union, where the pandemic had basically shut down borders, created barriers to the free movement of people and of goods. And there was this kind of mutual recriminations between the different countries, particularly between the northern and the southern states, over who was going to pay for this crisis. So would you mind basically telling us, in short, what's happened since then? Has there been any resolution to any of these questions?
Well, I suppose the short answer to that is more of the same, and no. The coronavirus, COVID-19 itself, has continued to kill more people in Europe. I think the most recent death toll I saw for the European Economic Area and UK together was over 100,000, 108,000 people whose lives have been lost as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the economic front, the European economy has entered into what many are predicting, what many are calling a depression. One pretty shocking estimate, and of course these estimates aren't based on a great deal, but one estimate that I saw from Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the European Central Bank, said that the worst case scenario, I think the worst case scenario could be much worse than this, but the worst case scenario is that Eurozone output could fall by 15% in 2020. To put that into context, in 2009, which was the last major crisis faced by the European Union, output dropped by about 4.5, less than 5%. So this is more than 3 times the size of the crisis faced at that. In terms of the jobs lost, one estimate has put up to 59 million jobs at risk in Europe, which I think really shows the scale of this crisis. And I think about 30 million people have applied for the equivalent of the furlough scheme that we have in Britain, effectively people who would be out of work were it not for state aids. Now, speaking of states, many European states are actually running out of the means, are really struggling actually to maintain these support measures, let alone the question of how they're actually going to drag themselves out of the crisis at the end of this lockdown. And so one thing you might have seen in the headlines is a number of states, and Britain's also talking about this, are looking to start to ease the lockdown conditions, mainly because they're panicking that if they don't, their economies are going to collapse. The problem with that is as soon as they start easing up, there is a very real risk of a second wave of coronavirus infections, and with it, second lockdown, which of course would defy the point of trying to open up for the sake of the economy anyway. And in the midst of all this, crisis at all levels and in all parts of the continent, really, not a single significant solution has been agreed by the leaders of the European Union. And this is really, it is posing an existential threat, not just to Italy's place in the European Union or the Euro, but to the EU itself.
Yeah, so I think that then raises the question: what is it that's stopping these countries coming to any agreement? Why can't they resolve this crisis? It seems like this is, as you've described, this is the deepest crisis really that's ever faced the European project, and yet they're fighting amongst themselves, seemingly over crumbs. But why can they not resolve this? What is stopping these countries coming together and actually moving forwards?
The key issue at hand is, well, it boils down to cold hard cash. And it boils down to the fact that the largely wealthier, less debt-laden northern states, with Germany very much at the centre, but the states like Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, will not accept the idea that they effectively have to bankroll, as they see it, bankroll the spending of weaker economies. You'll probably remember the reactionary trope about lazy Greek workers. The idea
Mm.
that hardworking German workers who've also faced austerity and have also faced a kind of a downward pressure on their wages over the last 10 years are effectively going to have to pay for higher borrowing costs, in order to bail out southern economies. This is what it comes down to every single time. It's what it came down to after 2009, and it's what's kind of scuppered a number of these big virtual summits that have taken place over the last month or so. It is really becoming farcical, and every single time the kind of key southern economies, and by southern actually, I think we would include France at this time. You're starting to see a
Mm.
group.
Mm.
Well, not even starting to see. We're very much seeing a group emerging with Italy, Spain, France. These aren't small European economies. We're not simply talking about the likes of Greece and Portugal, coming forward in a unified way and calling for, well, what they call solidarity. What they mean by that is cash in order to deal with the crisis. I don't want to take up too much time going through a recap of all these summits, but I think it
Mm.
illustrates the crisis in many ways. Last time I spoke to you, I can't remember when that was exactly, but about a month ago, there was one of these virtual summits of the European Council. So that's the leaders of the respective eurozone nations, European nations, and that ended amidst mutual recriminations, with no decision being made. The official decision that was made was they're gonna come to a decision later on. The leader of the council, Charles Michel, was having to run around in order just to be able to draft a joint statement that everyone was willing to sign. A statement which said absolutely nothing, in a kind of bedroom farce type scenario. After that, on the 9th of April, the Eurozone's finance ministers met up together and claimed that they found the solution, and basically announced proudly that they had basically that this time was going to be different. The head of this body announced, by the name of Centeno, he announced that 10 years ago we were so too slow to act, we couldn't agree, but this time it's going to be different. What they put forward, however, was 100 billion to support workers who are in need of basically employment support, which is dwarfed by the size of this crisis. But more importantly, the mechanism they put forward was not Corona bonds, which we discussed last time, an idea of
Mm.
a mutual debt instrument for the whole of the Eurozone. That was thrown out. But instead, the European Stability Mechanism. This was something that was introduced after the 2009 crisis and what happened with Greece. It has never been touched since,
Mm.
because in order to access the lending from the European Stability Mechanism, you have to accept certain conditions. It's the same as countries like Argentina or Venezuela having to come to the IMF. There are always painful strings attached, which equates to vicious austerity, privatizations, liberalization of labor relations, and so on, which is clearly anathema to the people of countries like Italy. Certainly, if you're using it for medical supplies and so on, then no strings will be attached, which is nice, but again, by no means enough. And the main problem that Italy's facing is not simply the health impacts of the crisis, but the fact that its economy is on the verge of collapse, and nothing has been proposed for that. To zoom forward, another summit took place last week. This was going to be the summit to end all summits. And the expectation was that something was going to be agreed because it had to be agreed. It's interesting to see the nervousness, actually, of, I suppose, what I call the more intelligent strategists of capital, writing in the Financial Times. I want to quote a paragraph from an article that came out the day before this summit last Thursday. It said the phrase "the moment of truth" is used more often than it's warranted. but it applies with full force to the EU leaders' summit on Thursday. What they agree, if anything, will definitively tell Europe's citizens, as well as global markets, this is big enough to forge a common European.
Sorry, Josh, we're losing you
A
a
lack
bit
of
on the
agreement
connection there.
deciding against one. Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
we lost a bit of the connection there. Do you want to just repeat the last couple of sentences?
Of course, yes. So the phrase moment of truth is used more often than is warranted. It applies with full force to the EU leaders' summit on Thursday. What they agree, if anything, will definitively tell Europe's citizens, as well as global markets, whether any crisis is big enough to forge a common European economic policy. A lack of agreement would amount to deciding against one. Once countries diverge towards different fortunes as the pandemic abates, it will be too late. So I'm sure you're wondering what exactly was agreed then, considering this is important. And what I can tell you is nothing was agreed. In contrary to the first summit, where Michel was running around trying to get a joint statement, they didn't even issue a joint statement in this particular case. If anything, the situation has become even worse. And the main subject of debate, if to call it that, this time was not corona bonds, which, as I mentioned, have been thrown out, but cold hard cash. Spain has come with not an announcement, sorry, but a proposal that the Egypt itself contains 1.5 trillion euros in grants, not loans, but cash that will be directly sent to the countries in most need, like Italy, like Spain. Incidentally, it's interesting that this is now the main voice is coming from Spain, whereas before that it's not just Italy that's facing the harshest side of this crisis. Also, Spain is being sucked into the vortex, if you like. So Spain has put forward this proposal for 1.5 trillion in direct grants. This has been rejected by the likes of Germany and the Netherlands, who are not in favour of this, because ultimately, where is the money going to come from? The money will either come from an increased cost of borrowing, which would be the effect of corona bonds, or it will effectively mean that the German, Dutch governments are going to have to themselves borrow more in order to put more into the EU budget. It's interesting that the way they've tried to fudge this one is the Commission has now been tasked with finding a balance between grants and loans. So having rejected a common debt instrument, having rejected grants, the Commission is going to have to now pull a rabbit out of the hat and invent something entirely new. Ursula von der Leyen seems very confident she's going to do that, and she thinks that she's going to do it through the upcoming EU budget. However, they've been wrangling over the EU budget for the last few years, even before this crisis. And so the situation is looking pretty much insoluble from the view of the EU institutions. And it's going to be completely inadequate. Trying to find a mix between maybe some grants, maybe even a few $100 billion in grants, would not be sufficient to cover the scale of this crisis. And further loans are, and some people feel they're unnecessary because the ECB is already basically printing money to buy, to lend effectively to the Italians and other countries. But it's simply dwarfed by the scale of the problem, and it becomes a question of how much exactly are the German ruling class going to be prepared to shell out. Merkel has said actually that Germany would be prepared to pay more into the EU budget. But privately, EU diplomats are apparently saying that their appetite for this is nowhere near enough, that perhaps they'd be prepared to contribute towards the 100 billion short-term unemployment scheme. There's no way that they're going to be shelling out or contributing to 1.5 trillion euros, which is what the Spanish is saying is required. To make a general point about this, all this squabbling over the amount of money, it demonstrates the impossibility, ultimately, of binding together economies which are moving in fundamentally different directions. Obviously, as we've discussed previously, what the European Union is an attempt to unify individual capitalist nation states, but it does it on the basis of those nation states, which of course have their own ruling classes, they have their own markets, and they have their own interests. And clearly it's not in the interest of the German bourgeois, who've been carrying out austerity against their own workers, to increase their costs in order to cover the spending of a country over whose budget they have no control. Nor is it in the interest of the Italian bourgeois and the Italian state to accept loans in conditions for handing over the control of their budget, and therefore austerity over their own citizens, who elect them ultimately, into the hands of another government. And
so
we can
Josh,
see... Sorry.
It looks then like the southern states that you've been describing, they're in a difficult position, and they're being left high and dry. Basically, we're seeing not so much European solidarity, but just complete, turning their backs on one another. So, what do you think's the perspective for the southern countries, given that they're not getting any love from the northern neighbours?
The perspective on overall is an increased divergence between these different countries as an attempt to bind together countries that are moving different directions. And tragically, it will be these countries will probably face the harshest end of the corona in Italy. Setting aside the UK, Spain and Italy have the highest death toll in Europe. France is catching up. But it's exactly these countries who have had less to spend and been less able to borrow in order to fund emergency stimulus packages. So Italy has committed 25 billion euros so far, as package. France has committed 45 billion euros. Germany has committed 150 billion euros because it has had a much lower debt to GDP ratio. It's been able to draw on borrowing to a much greater extent. So this means that you've got weaker economies that are hit harder by the crisis. It's not true that we're all in this together, and will have less means to be able to pull themselves out of the crisis. This means they will sink further and more rapidly, whilst the other countries will do what they can to basically to maintain themselves as much as possible. Although it must be said, even these more wealthy countries like Germany are going to be hit hard by the crisis. And at the centre of all this, I did mention earlier that it's not just Italy. I don't want to give the impression that basically Italy is a problem and the rest of Europe is safe and sound. That's not the case. But at the centre of this is Italy. The situation faced by Italy is dire, both in terms of the effect on its health service from the coronavirus, which is perhaps not unique to Italy, the economic impact. A best case scenario being predicted by analysts is that Italy's debt to GDP ratio will stand at over 150%. That's the best case. That means that the amount of debt the Italian state owes to creditors, both its own banks and foreign creditors, will be 1.5 times greater than its entire economy over the course of a year. That is utterly unsustainable. Just to give you a comparison, in 2009, Greece had a debt to GDP ratio of 126%, and it catapulted towards the default. The worst case scenario currently is predicted that Italy will have over 180% debt to GDP. That's about the same amount that Greece has now. At the same time, I think we spoke last time about this spread between the cost of borrowing for Italy and for Germany. I don't think I have time to go into detail, but this is a very worrying sign. It suggests that Italy is moving towards a default if, despite having the same currency, it actually costs more to issue bonds in euros in Italy than in Germany.
But Josh, you've talked a lot about the economic conditions within the Eurozone and these economic tensions. But is it simply an economic question? Is there a political element to this this standoff, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point to stress because ultimately, even with Italy, I think the truth is that Italy is, just touching back on economics very briefly, Italy is reaching a crisis point similar to Greece. But Italy is not Greece. It's a considerably larger economy. And so an Italian default would really pose an existential threat to the bloc. And it could not be bailed out like Greece. But the point is, and this is the political point, in reality, the EU is not going to disintegrate and fall apart simply because of economics. In fact, I would be very surprised if any ruling class in the bloc, even in these conditions, decide that it's in its economic interests to separate. It's a question of preferring to hang separately rather than hang together. Preferring to hang together rather than hang separately. However, politically, eventually, and we kind of saw this with Brexit, although this is much more serious than Brexit, eventually, simply remaining in the bloc and remaining in the euro become completely politically unsustainable. When you have Italians dying as a result of this coronavirus crisis, appealing, as they did at the end of February, for aid from their European neighbours with whom they're in this, brotherhood, this European project, and receiving nothing except for scorn, being told by their counterparts in the Netherlands, for example, that they can only receive aid if they reform their economies, which is very similar to the slur against Greek workers in the past. What you're starting to see is a huge rise in not just Eurosceptic, anti-EU feeling in Italy, which incidentally was relatively high already. A recent poll said that two-thirds of Italians now, over two-thirds of Italians, feel that it's a disadvantage to be in the EU. This is a founding member of the European coal and steel community, which eventually became the EU. This is a very serious business, and it also happens to be the third largest economy in the Eurozone. But beyond Italy, within Italy, you've got the pressure being put on Giuseppe Conte and the government by the likes of Matteo Salvini, the League, who, of course, in probably an opportunist way, in a cynical way, are drumming up, are pointing to the suffering of Italians, linking it with the complete inadequacy and the callousness of the European institutions, which is not wrong. And of course, they're then therefore whipping up discontent against the European Union. And unless it's able to deliver something, it won't be able to respond to those arguments. Actually, Emmanuel Macron put it very well, because he's also facing his own pressures. He said, Europe has no future if we cannot find a response to this exceptional shock. And that is very much a political question. But it's not just a question of Italy. You're actually seeing very bitter divisions and backbiting across the whole bloc now. You have Italian, not just Italian, but other southern state politicians taking out full-page advertisements in German newspapers talking about how after the war, German reparations were forgiven by fellow European nations, therefore Germany should do the same, making explicit reference to the Nazis, which doesn't tend to go down well, to be honest, if you're debating with the Germans. I remember the Greeks made a similar argument during their crisis. In other words, an institution that was designed to overcome this national resentment and the divisions of the past that were supposed to unify us in European brotherhood is actually, I would say, making the situation more acute. It's actually driving the crisis itself.
And what do you think underlies that? You touched on it a bit earlier, but what are the fundamental contradictions and problems at the heart of the European project under capitalism that lead to not, internationalism, but this mutual recrimination, this breakup on a nationalist basis? What are the real processes that underlie that, do you think?
At root, European integration itself, on a capitalist basis, is a contradiction. The entire project is based on a contradiction. It is attempting to overcome the limitations of single nation states, each with their own markets, each with their own interests, on the basis of those self-same nation states. It's attempting to create, ultimately the aim, we must remember, the aim of the European project is apparently to create a European federation similar to the United States. But what the kind of pioneers of European integration forget to mention is, first of all, the unification of America, of Germany, and so on, was made in a totally different era. But also, it was done on the basis of war. It wasn't done on the basis of forming a single market in which you have different national ruling classes all competing with each other and having an interest in exploiting each other. You see this, just to give one small example. The Spanish finance minister made a very pointed remark about tax harmonization, saying we need to strengthen European integration by all having effectively the same fiscal tax regime, which, if you're going to unify the continent, makes a lot of sense. But it makes no sense whatsoever if you are the Prime Minister of the Netherlands or Luxembourg, who benefits directly from tax avoidance from other countries, actually, companies bringing their investment into your country because of your low tax rates. How do you overcome the interests of various different capitalist nation states? It's either by one nation state basically demolishing the rest by war, which I don't think is on the cards and clearly is not a progressive answer to the problem, or it effectively reaches a dead end, which is what we're seeing now. It must be remembered that the whole European project started after the Second World War, in a period of immense boom for the capitalist system, a historic boom, at least for the advanced Western capitalist countries. It's never faced a crisis like this. The closest comparison, I guess, is to the 30s. Even that isn't apt. The European Union has never faced anything like this. And ultimately, what we see in the European Union, I would argue, is a partial transitional regime attempting to overcome these contradictions. And as we see in history, these transitional regimes are inherently unstable. Either it'll go forward, and in that case, all of these national interests will be effectively eliminated and subsumed into an overall European nation state, which I have to say, on the basis of this, is impossible on a capitalist basis, or it will sink back. It will break up and its mutual recriminations into the nation states which made it up in the first place, which would be an incredibly reactionary outcome, which would lead to more suffering for the European working class. Not that I'm defending the European Union on that basis.
So what do you think is the likely perspective for the European Union? Does it have any future? I mean, on the last time we talked, we played the final countdown as a kind of funeral march for the European Union. And is that what you think really we're facing here?
I think it is, to put it bluntly. I mean, Italy's facing economic collapse. Either it will receive all the aid it's asking for, which is extremely unlikely. If it does receive all that aid, that will put off the inevitable, in my opinion. However, at the expense of effectively sucking up all the toxic assets, all the poison, into the overall European institutions themselves. The European Central Bank cannot just perpetually keep on propping the national economies up. At a certain point, the national contradictions will just express themselves over the whole of the bloc, I would say. Some people are talking about the ECB just constantly printing money. I think we've seen in history what that eventually leads to, even with an economy the size of the European Union. If that doesn't happen, which I think is the least likely scenario anyway, then either Italy would default, and if Italy defaults, then it will probably fall out of the euro, and with it the EU as well. This is a founding member, or it will choose to leave the euro anyway, because the prospect of staying in the euro and the EU would be decades of vicious austerity levied against the working class of that country, and I just don't think they'll accept it. If that happens, then that will be the end of the European Union as we know it, because it won't simply be Italy leaving. It'll raise a whole question mark over the relationship between the northern countries and the southern countries. We haven't even had time to talk about what's going on to the east of Germany. Even Poland now is actually starting to raise demands for more aid. And of course, in Hungary, you effectively have the establishment of dictatorial powers in the midst of this crisis. All of these things are converging. They're not accidental, oh, isn't it a shame that this has suddenly appeared? All of these are expressions of a deeper fundamental crisis. And that fundamental crisis isn't just a European phenomenon. It's the crisis of capitalism. You talked about does the EU have any future? And sometimes I find myself, when I'm reading about the prevarications, the bickering, the impotence of the leaders of the European nations and of the European bloc itself, and I think, and you see this also, this exasperation in the kind of the Financial Times and the capitalist press, and it looks as if it's farcical, and it looks as if they've gone mad. But it actually reminds me of figures like Louis XVI and Charles I. You look back through history, and often historians will say, well, if only he'd done this more sensible reform, if only he hadn't conspired against the revolution, he might not have lost his head. And I kind of, when you see leaders all over Europe losing their heads, I think there is an analogy to be drawn here. Absolutism was a doomed institution. The kind of the soil on which it had grown up, its basis, its reason to exist, had been removed. And all that was left was kind of to lop off this now leprous appendage. The EU itself is a doomed institution in my opinion, because of the reasons that we've briefly been able to outline. Because it's linked to a doomed system. In times of boom, in times of in the good times, it's possible for countries to band together and maybe share about some of the loot. But in hard times, it's simply not possible for different capitalist classes, who ultimately have an interest in competing and exploiting each other and exploiting the working class collectively, to come to anything like a democratic and progressive solution to this problem. Ultimately, Europe as a whole, regardless of its institutions, Europe as a continent cannot go forward under capitalism. The coronavirus and the response of these countries has shown that what we need is actually remarkably simple. What we need is not to restart the production of luxury goods or to reopen Greggs. And I've got nothing against Greggs whatsoever. But in the midst of this crisis, what we need is an international plan to produce the medical equipment necessary, the food goods, the necessities necessary under safe conditions for those workers in order to make sure that as few people suffer and die as possible. And then the restarting the economy should be entirely on the basis of workers' control. The workers to decide how and when they should go back to work. And if society will run on such a basis, then we would see a great deal less suffering, a great deal less unemployment, and a progressive future, not only for the European nations, but more importantly, for the European continent as a whole. Ultimately, I am in favour of the unification of Europe. I'm not in favour of the European Union because I don't think it's capable of achieving the unification of Europe. I'm in favour of abolishing national divisions across Europe and across the world. But the only way we can do that is abolishing the class divisions, which we see all around us in an extremely acute form as a result of this crisis, and are actually making the workers ultimately pay for the full cost of this historic humanitarian crisis. We can't do with it anymore. The only way we can unify Europe is not on the basis of a common market, but on common property of all the European workers working on single socialist plan. What that means, the conclusion that I come to, is if we want to avoid the barbaric perspective of this whole thing going backwards and breaking up with, I very much doubt war between the European nations, but certainly more friction, more suffering, unemployment, and so on. If you want to avoid that perspective, I think we are bound to fight for socialism in all of our countries across Europe and the world, to overthrow this defunct doomed system along with its imperialist institutions like the EU, and replace it with a democratic, socialist, workers' Europe, a united socialist states of Europe.
Thank you very much, Josh. I think that's an excellent place to end it for tonight, because I want to announce to our viewers that on Friday we're going to be celebrating May Day across Europe, across the whole world. And so the International Marxist Tendency is going to be hosting a special IMT May Day rally at 4 p.m. UK time. So tune in on our Facebook and YouTube channels then in order to see speakers from Britain, from Brazil, from Italy, from the US, from Pakistan, and Alan Woods, one of our leading authors on Marxist.com. Just thanks again to Josh for joining us tonight, and hopefully see you again, I'm sure, soon to discuss the EU and other subjects. See you soon, Josh. Have a good evening.
Okay.
And just a reminder that obviously we are going to continue IMTV episodes beyond Friday's May Day rally. We've got obviously also Alan Woods' series on the English Revolution that you can watch on our YouTube channel. And also next Wednesday, same time, same place, we'll be interviewing Serge Goulart, one of the leading activists in the Brazilian section of the International Marxist Tendency, who's going to be talking about the incredibly incompetent, pernicious role played by Bolsonaro in Brazil and the effect of the coronavirus there. So join us again, as I say, on Friday for the May Day rally, and next Wednesday for another episode of IMTV. See you soon.